Alright, ladies, I know you just had a quiz. I'm sorry that all of this is piled on top of each other. But the main reason we're trying to get this done is because there's only 2 academic weeks left, and then you'll have the week for review before your final exam. So we're going to get through Chapter 7 and 8 this week and next week. And ultimately, what these 2 chapters do together is they talk about how you can take everything you've learned this year and apply it to your life. So these are very important chapters, and it's my hope that by the end of them you're understanding how all of what we learned this year can apply to your life. So the focus question for this chapter is what must I do to be an authentic disciple of Christ? So you guys are, in case you don't know, ultimately what authentic means is real. But what does it mean to be a real disciple of Christ? So how can we not just do what we're supposed to? How can we not just follow a specific set of rules, but how can we genuinely want to be a follower of Christ and apply that in our lives? So that's the focus question for this whole chapter. We're going to talk a little bit about it today, but also for the rest of the week. So today we're going over the introduction, which is about becoming a disciple. The main idea is that Jesus' invitation to be his disciple is predicated in action. So understanding, commitment, and willingness to share the good news. That is ultimately what it means to be a disciple. There's significantly more to it, which we're going to break down today and in this next week. So you guys might be familiar with the story in Mark. I didn't put the whole story in because you've probably heard it, but ultimately there was a guy who wanted to serve Jesus to the greatest of his capacity. So he asked him, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "You must obey all of the commandments." And he's like, "I already obey all the commandments, I'm good." And he said, "And you must go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor." And this guy who asked him was super duper rich. And so he kind of walked away super disappointed. I don't want to give everything I have to the poor. Why would I do that? Are you crazy? And so this chapter kind of breaks down what we must do to inherit eternal life, because we don't get to walk with Jesus and ask him in the same way. But all people have, so we've all been given this gift. All of you are in Catholic education, and you have been. Most of you have been for a while, but you at least have been for this past year. And so you know what the faith is, and you have an option. You have the responsibility to respond in whatever way you decide. So there's rejection and acceptance and everything in between. The most common thing in between is like lukewarmness. Like, well, I kind of accept this and that, but I don't really feel like I have to go out and do anything about it. And so, but these 2 chapters pretty much say the exact opposite of that. It talks about how acceptance of the faith gives you a responsibility to it. And so Jesus does, like in the story, Jesus does call all of us to keep the commandments, but also he calls us to give of ourselves for the sake of his kingdom. So that will look differently for every single person you ever meet, every person in this classroom, every person everywhere. But for you, you have to ask God what it means for you. So for this guy who talked to Jesus, that's what it was. It was to give up all that he owned and sell it and give it to the poor. That might not be your vocation. It might not be what you're called to do. And so it's important for us to have this relationship with God so we know what he calls us to do. Universally, he does call us to keep the commandments. Many people realize what it means to be a disciple and choose to walk away. So like this guy in the story, he heard that he has to give away all this stuff that he worked very hard to have, but Jesus saw that that's what was keeping him from ultimately living the greatest life he could live as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, as a disciple, and so he chose to walk away. And so when we hear what we have to do, it's oftentimes easy for us to do the same thing. So the most common people leave. So this was a study done. Your book goes more in depth. These answers are just from that study. But the most common reason people leave is that they drift away which you guys are familiar with the concept, I'm sure, but ultimately they know the faith, they accept the faith, they love the faith, but then they kind of get bored with it and realize or kind of consider that maybe it's not that important to them, or they don't really need to go to a Sunday Mass or get involved. They just kind of want to pick and choose what they want. And then all of a sudden it's not a part of their life. Other reasons are the rules and rigidity, lack of faith, so they hear all these things but they just don't believe it, or a distaste for the community. That's pretty common. A lot of people have bad experiences with other Christians or Catholics, and they decide that they just don't want to deal with that type of community. Lastly, being a disciple is challenging but rewarding. Your book goes very in-depth into this, and they do a good job explaining this more in-depth than in one line. But ultimately, being a disciple of Christ is not going to be easy. It's not going to be a piece of cake where you get patted on the back all the time, you're constantly being encouraged, or you're constantly being built up by the people around you. But when we get to heaven and realize that all we did was not without merit and was for the sake of somebody who did so much for us, we'll realize that it was very much worth the sacrifices we had to make. So learning from other disciples, this ultimately, what it comes down to is three very simple things. Committing yourself to Jesus is worth it, but it's not just like a once and done kind of thing. Some denominations of Christianity do feel that once you have this encounter with Christ, you're always going to be saved, and they all do have steps to take in furthering their faith, but it really comes down to like a continuous effort toward conversion. It's not something you don't just accept Jesus and then walk away from him. No, you are invited to do three things. First of all, you're called to know Jesus. So this is kind of the first step in your relationship with God, in understanding what it means to be a disciple of Christ. So you know Jesus. Learn his teachings with intellect, sound will, and upright heart. So in the same way you would get to know a friend of yours, or a parent, or a teacher, or I don't know, whoever else you guys get to know, you would learn, this is what they believe, this is what I like about them, this is what I understand. I want to know them even more. So think about a friend that you've kind of had this encounter with, and all of a sudden you want to know so much more about them because of this encounter was so great. And so in the same way, when you have an encounter with Jesus, you've had this encounter, and then you kind of sit down, have coffee, and get to know him as a person. And so once you've reached that level of relationship with him, he invites us to go deeper with him into a whole new level of friendship. So you guys might be friends with each other. You have this encounter, you kind of like each other, then you decide, I'm going to hang out with them a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. When you guys become BFFs, would be like the equivalent. Obviously, it's much different because it's Jesus, and no offense, but none of you guys are quite to that level of perfection yet. And so when Jesus invites us to enter this next level, would be a similar concept to you guys becoming BFFs. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I'm not trying to belittle the relationship with God that we can have, but just try to make it more relatable. So do make the distinction, but also try to make a connection, if that makes any sense. And then lastly, to serve God. So once you've had this BFF relationship with somebody, you would do anything for them, most likely. Hopefully not literally anything, but Jesus calls us to serve him. And so to stand firm in the face of challenges, to defend him, to stand up for him, to imitate him, and to do all of these things that we're called to do as Christians. And so committing ourselves to Jesus is worth it, and this is usually what it looks like. We're called to know, love, and serve him. Your book uses a little bit different of words. This is basically the main idea of this whole concept, is what we're called to do as disciples. And so, so I think that's it for today. That was a lot longer than I planned on it being. Here are your comprehension questions. Describe authentic. You guys can use your computers. And then, lastly, what must you do to be an authentic disciple of Christ? Have a